What starts as a simple courtroom hearing turns into something no one in Richmond saw coming. When a proud, arrogant police officer thinks he can walk into court and humiliate a black woman standing near the judge's bench, he makes the biggest mistake of his life. Because she's not just anyone, she's the judge. And what follows is a powerful showdown between ego, corruption, and justice, the kind that leaves a whole city holding its breath. Stay with us, because trust me, you won't believe how this ends. And before we get started, let us know what time you're listening and where you're watching from. Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear from you. A cold, heavy silence settled over the Richmond courthouse that morning. Outside, news crews crowded the sidewalk, their camera lenses focused on the grand stone entrance like vultures waiting for a sign of weakness. Inside, the buzz of conversation echoed off the marble walls, lawyers whispering strategy, reporters preparing their notes, courthouse clerks shuffling paperwork with the kind of tired precision that only comes from years of routine. But this wasn't going to be just another routine day. Everyone in that room felt it, even if they couldn't quite explain why. The case scheduled for that morning had already attracted citywide attention. Civil rights advocates, legal watchdogs, and even everyday citizens had gathered to witness what many were calling the most important police misconduct trial the city had seen in decades. And right in the center of it all, Officer Bradley Knox. Now, if you've never heard that name before, you're lucky, because in Richmond, Virginia, that name carried weight. It carried fear. Bradley Knox had spent nearly 15 years on the force known for his aggression, his control, and his refusal to be questioned by anyone. People whispered about him behind closed doors, about the way he patrolled certain neighborhoods with a heavy hand, about the way complaints seemed to disappear before anyone could act on them. But today, he'd been called to answer for it all. And he didn't like that. Not one bit. You could hear him before you saw him, the sharp stomp of his boots as he pushed through the courtroom doors like he owned the place. His posture was rigid, chest puffed out as if daring someone to challenge him. His uniform was crisp, perfectly pressed. Every movement screamed authority, dominant. And in his mind, he wasn't here as the accused. No, he was here to put on a show, to remind everyone who he thought really held the power in this city. He scanned the room, looking for someone to direct his frustration toward, someone who looked out of place. And then, his eyes landed on her. A black woman standing by the judge's bench, speaking calmly with a few attorneys, flipping through a thick folder of legal documents. She wore a tailored navy blue blazer, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression unreadable. She didn't look rushed, she didn't look afraid. In fact, she looked like she belonged there. And that set something off in him. His lip curled slightly, a sneer forming on his face as he started walking toward her. The room around him seemed to blur into the background. He didn't see the attorneys. He didn't see the bailiff. He didn't see the press. He just saw her. He stopped just a few feet away, towering over her with that same entitled smirk he'd worn for years on the streets. "Figures," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You people are always in the way." The chatter in the courtroom died instantly. Papers stopped rustling. Conversations froze mid-sentence. All eyes turned toward him. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink, but that only seemed to fuel his fire. He took another step forward, leaning in, his voice low but venomous. "Standing around like you run this place, thinking you can give me orders. You need to remember your place." You could feel the air leave the room, like every wall had closed in at once, like time itself had hit pause. Still, she didn't move. Instead, she calmly adjusted her blazer, as if brushing off imaginary dust. She turned to face him fully, tilting her head just slightly, studying him not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Something cold, controlled. And then, the courtroom doors swung open behind them. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Naomi Bradford." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. The officer's smirk faltered for the first time. His head snapped toward the door, expecting someone else to walk through. A man, maybe. Someone older, someone white, someone who looked like a judge in his mind. But no one entered. Instead, the woman he had just humiliated took one slow, deliberate step forward. Then another. and another. She walked right past him, past the attorneys, past the stunned onlookers, until she reached the judge's bench. She didn't look back. She didn't say a word. She simply took her seat, leaned back, and rang her gavel. That sound, that one sharp crack of the gavel, it echoed the courtroom like thunder. And in that moment, Officer Bradley Knox knew he had just made the biggest mistake of his entire life. Because the woman he had just tried to intimidate, the woman he had just humiliated in front of everyone, wasn't just anyone. She was the judge. And before this day was over, the entire city would see exactly what happens when arrogance meets justice. You could almost hear the temperature shift in the room, from tense to electric, from whispers to complete silence. It felt like every pair of lungs in that courtroom had stopped breathing at the same time. People had heard stories about Officer Bradley Knox. People had heard about his anger, his ego, and the trail of complaints left behind him. But nobody had ever seen him this exposed before. And right there, in front of God and everybody, he looked like a man trying to claw his way out of a moment he could no longer control. But you know what happens when you back a man like that into a corner? He doesn't back down. He doubles down. He digs deeper. He pushes harder. And that's exactly what Bradley Knox did. The smirk that had slipped from his face returned sharper this time, more forced. He straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and puffed out his chest like a man trying to save face in front of a crowd that had already seen him fall. He took another step forward toward the bench toward Judge Naomi Bradford. "I don't care who you are," he said, loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. "You don't talk to me like that. You don't look at me like that." His voice dripped with venom, shaking the already fragile air in the room. Naomi didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She leaned forward ever so slightly, resting her elbows on the polished wood in front of her, and locked eyes with the man standing below her. "Officer Knox," she said, her voice as steady as stone, "take your seat." But Knox didn't budge. Instead, he stepped closer, violating every rule of courtroom conduct, every boundary of respect. The bailiff shifted uneasily, glancing toward the attorneys, waiting for someone to intervene. But no one moved. No one dared. Bradley Knox slammed his palm down on the edge of the bench, leaning in, lowering his voice to a growl that only Naomi could hear. "You people don't deserve to sit up there," he hissed. "And you damn sure don't deserve to tell me what to do." The bailiff took a cautious step forward, his hand twitching toward the radio at his side. But Naomi raised one finger, a silent command that froze him in place. She didn't need protection. Not from this. Not from him. She stood slowly, her chair sliding back with a soft scrape that somehow sounded louder than a gunshot. The room leaned in, as Naomi placed both hands flat on the bench, staring down at Knox with a calm that felt more dangerous than any outburst could ever be. "Officer Knox," she repeated, her voice low, measured, and full of finality. "Take your seat." You could feel it, the shift, the moment when even Knox realized he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But instead of stepping back, he did something no one expected. He reached out and grabbed Naomi's wrist. Gasps exploded from every corner of the courtroom, the sound of chairs scraping the floor, people standing up, phones coming out to record. The bailiff lunged forward, but Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She didn't show fear. She leaned in closer, just inches from his face. "Let go," she whispered, so softly that only he could hear it. And for the first time in his entire career, Bradley Knox's hand trembled. He loosened his grip, but his face twisted into something uglier than anyone had seen yet. His mouth curled, his teeth clenched, and without thinking, without stopping, he shoved her backward, just hard enough to make a statement, but more than enough to send shockwaves through the entire building. The courtroom erupted, shouting, screaming, phones recording from every angle. The bailiff tackled Knox in an instant, pinning him to the floor as attorneys rushed toward the bench. Naomi caught herself on the edge of her chair, never losing her footing, never losing her composure. She stood tall as the bailiff struggled to restrain the furious officer beneath him. Knox thrashed, shouting profanities, his voice cracking with rage and humiliation. "Get off me! You don't touch me! None of you touch me!" But the damage was done. The cameras had captured it. The witnesses had seen it. The city would hear about it before the hour was over. Judge Naomi Bradford stood at the edge of the bench, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Clear the courtroom," she commanded, her voice sharper than anyone had ever heard. "Now!" The bailiff barked orders as people scrambled to gather their things. Reporters shouted questions that Naomi ignored. Knox, still pinned to the floor, kept fighting like a man who knew his career his entire life had just come crashing down around him. As the gallery emptied, Naomi never took her eyes off him, not for a second. When the last person had been escorted out, she nodded to the bailiff. "Bring him to his seat," she ordered. Reluctantly, Knox was dragged to the defense table. His face was red, his breathing heavy, but the fight in him had dimmed just a little. Naomi watched him closely as she slowly, deliberately took her seat once again. The courtroom, once chaotic, had gone still, almost eerily so. Naomi leaned forward, folded her hands, and spoke in a voice so calm, so steady, that it sent chills through everyone who could hear her. "Let the record reflect," she began, "that Officer Bradley Knox just assaulted a sitting judge, in open court, in front of the public, the press, and the law he claims to uphold." Knox shifted in his seat, his jaw twitching as he stared at the floor. "And let it further reflect," Naomi continued, "that this is no longer just a misconduct hearing. This is criminal." She turned to the bailiff once more. "Call the U.S. Attorney's Office," she said, "and do not let this man leave this building." The bailiff nodded and stepped out to make the call. Naomi leaned back in her chair, never looking away from the man who had just tried to humiliate her. But here's the thing about power: it doesn't always come with a badge. It doesn't always come with a uniform. Sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is the one who never had to raise their voice, and in that moment, it wasn't Officer Bradley Knox who held the power. It was Judge Naomi Bradford, and the fight had only just begun. As Officer Bradley Knox sat at the defense table, his body tense and trembling with rage, the weight of the room pressed down on him like a collapsing ceiling. You could see it in his face. He was scrambling to figure out how this had happened. How had he lost control so quickly? How had the balance of power shifted so completely, right in front of his eyes? But that's the thing about arrogance. It blinds you. It makes you think you're untouchable, until you're not. And that's exactly where Bradley Knox found himself, caught, exposed, and completely powerless in the very courtroom where he thought he'd walk in and put on a show of dominance. But instead of applause, he got handcuffs. Instead of respect, he got silence. The kind of silence that feels like a punishment all on its own. Judge Naomi Bradford sat on the bench, steady as stone. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't thrown accusations. She hadn't played to the crowd. No, she did what true power always does. She let the truth speak for itself. And now, the truth was sitting right there in front of her, breathing heavy, avoiding her gaze, knowing that the whole world had just watched him cross a line he couldn't uncross. The bailiff returned, confirming that the U.S. Attorney's Office had been notified and that federal prosecutors were already en route to the courthouse. The news spread like wildfire through the halls. People who had already left the courtroom started gathering again outside the doors. Reporters fired off headlines faster than they could even think of the words. Social media lit up with clips, photos, and hashtags. The city of Richmond was waking up to what had just gone down. And trust me, nobody was going to sleep on this one. Inside the courtroom, Naomi didn't move. She didn't need to. The silence worked in her favor. Every second that ticked by felt heavier, more unbearable for Knox. His lawyer, a slick, sharp-dressed man named Alan Griffin, leaned in close, whispering furiously in his ear. Knox didn't respond. He just sat there, fists clenched, jaw locked, breathing like a man trapped in a nightmare. Alan stood up, clearing his throat, trying to regain control of the moment. "Your Honor," he began, "given the unexpected nature of the incident, I respectfully request that my client be given a moment to step outside and collect himself before we proceed." Naomi leaned back, folding her arms across her chest, her expression unreadable. "Your client can collect himself right where he is," she replied without hesitation. "He's not going anywhere." Alan's jaw tightened, but he forced a professional nod, sitting back down beside Knox. He leaned in again, this time with more urgency, more panic. But Knox still didn't respond. It was like he had finally realized there was nowhere left to run. Naomi took a deep breath and addressed the courtroom staff. "We will proceed with the scheduled hearing," she announced, her voice firm. "And the record will reflect that Officer Knox remains in federal custody pending additional charges." The attorneys at the prosecution table exchanged glances. One of them, Carla Mendoza, civil rights attorney with a reputation for ripping corrupt officers apart on the stand, stood up, her face serious, her voice steady. "Your Honor," she began, "before we proceed with today's witnesses, the people request permission to enter additional video evidence into the record, evidence that speaks directly to Officer Knox's pattern of behavior, not just today, but over the course of his career." Naomi nodded. "Proceed, Miss Mendes." Carla walked to the center of the courtroom, holding up a small remote. She turned toward the large screen on the wall. The jury, the audience, and yes, Officer Knox could all see clearly. With a single press of a button, the screen came to life. It started with footage from a body camera, shaky, low-light video, showing Knox pulling a black teenager out of a parked car, slamming him to the ground, knee in his back, shouting orders the boy couldn't even process fast enough to obey. The boy's voice trembled through the speakers. "Please, I didn't do anything. I live here. Please." Gasps filled the courtroom. Some people covered their mouths. Others shook their heads in disgust. Carla pressed the button again. Another video appeared, this one from a cell phone. Knox standing over a man in handcuffs, knee pressed hard into his neck, yelling, "You fit the description. Don't move, or I swear I'll break your face." Another press, another video, and another, each one worse than the last. Each one showing a man who had treated his badge like a license to abuse, to intimidate, to terrorize. By the time the fifth video ended, the room felt like it was holding its breath again. Naomi leaned forward, her eyes locked on Knox. "Officer Knox," she said, her voice razor sharp, "do you deny the incidents took place?" Knox didn't move. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, urging him to stay silent. But Naomi wasn't interested in silence. "I asked you a question," she pressed, her voice cutting deeper. "Do you deny that this is who you are?" Knox's jaw twitched. He stared down at the table, his hands trembling. Carla stepped closer to the bench. "Your Honor, the people are prepared to call their first witness, Malcolm Johnson." At the mention of the name, Knox's head snapped up. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked a man the community knew all too well. Malcolm Johnson, 63 years old, a retired civil rights leader, a man whose own grandson had been one of Knox's victims. Malcolm walked slowly but with purpose, every step measured, every eye in the room on him. He took the stand, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. As he sat down, Naomi leaned forward once more, her voice softer this time, but no less powerful. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "please, tell us what you witnessed." And just like that, the tide shifted again, because this wasn't just about evidence anymore. This was personal. There are moments in life when everything stops feeling like a story someone else is telling, and suddenly becomes your story. Real, heavy, unavoidable. And for every single person sitting in that courtroom, this was that moment. Malcolm Johnson adjusted the microphone in front of him, cleared his throat softly, and glanced around the room, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with the kind of calm that only comes from a man who's already survived the worst this country could throw at him. A man who had lived through marches, protests, police raids, and broken promises, and was somehow still standing. And right now, he was the one holding all the weight in the room. All eyes turned to him. Even Officer Bradley Knox, who'd been shifting nervously, clenching his jaw, gripping the table so hard his knuckles had gone. White couldn't look away. Malcolm leaned in, his voice steady, raw, and full of quiet power. "My name is Malcolm Johnson. I've lived in Richmond my whole life, raised my kids here, raised my grandkids here, and for the last 20 years, I've watched officers like that man right there." He pointed directly at Knox. "Treat people who look like me like we don't belong in our own city." Knox flinched ever so slightly, but Malcolm didn't stop. "My grandson, Andre," Malcolm continued, his voice tightening with emotion. "He was 16 when Officer Knox grabbed him outside our church. No warning, no explanation, just slammed him to the ground like he was nothing. You could hear the shift in the room again, the kind of shift that makes people lean forward in their seats, not daring to miss a single word. He was walking home from youth choir practice, Malcolm went on, wearing a suit and tie, carrying a Bible, and somehow, that made him a threat in this man's eyes. Malcolm paused, his throat working hard to push the words out. Knox didn't ask questions, he didn't check the facts, he didn't care. He fractured 3 of Andre's ribs that night. And when we tried to file a complaint, it disappeared. Like it never happened. The air grew thicker. You could practically feel the weight pressing down on everyone's chest. Naomi didn't rush him. She didn't move. She just sat there, letting every word Malcolm spoke settle like bricks in the foundation of a case that had just become impossible to ignore. Malcolm leaned back slightly, his voice growing softer, but somehow even heavier. I've watched this happen again and again. To my neighbors, to my friends, to kids who never did a thing wrong. And every time, they told us to move on. Told us it wasn't worth fighting. Told us nothing would change. He shook his head slowly. But today, I'm done being silent, and I know I'm not alone. A ripple moved through the gallery, quiet nods, teary eyes, clenched fists held tightly in laps. The community was here, and they weren't going anywhere. Naomi leaned forward now, folding her hands in front of her. Mr. Johnson, she said softly, why did you decide to come forward today? Malcolm didn't hesitate. Because my grandson still wakes up in the middle of the night holding his chest, afraid to go outside after dark. Because my neighbors still walk with their heads down when they see a police cruiser roll by. Because too many of us have spent decades believing the law was never meant for us, only against us. He looked directly at Naomi now, his eyes shining with something raw and real. And because today, for the first time in a long time, it feels like maybe, just maybe, that's finally starting to change. The courtroom held that silence again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It wasn't suffocating. It was hope. Naomi nodded once, her voice steady as stone. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, she said quietly. Your words have been heard, and they will be remembered. Malcolm stepped down from the stand, never looking at Knox again. He didn't need to. His words had done the work, and the truth was already out in the open. But Naomi wasn't finished. She turned her attention back to Knox, who sat stiff as a statue, his lawyer practically gripping his arm to keep him from lashing out again. Officer Knox, Naomi said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Do you have anything to say for yourself? The room held its breath again. Knox swallowed hard, his jaw tightening so hard it looked like it might snap. For a moment, it seemed like he was about to speak, like maybe, he'd take responsibility, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and turned his head away like a child caught in a lie but too proud to admit it. Naomi's face didn't change, but the room felt it. The final nail in the coffin. She leaned back in her chair, glancing toward the attorneys. This hearing will continue, she announced, but let the record show that Officer Knox has once again chosen silence over accountability. The prosecution stood ready to call their next witness, but Naomi held up her hand. No, she said, her voice firm. Not yet. She turned to the bailiff. Clear the gallery, she ordered. Bring in the federal prosecutors. The attorneys exchanged glances, realizing what Naomi was about to do. This wasn't going to be just another misconduct hearing. No, this was bigger. This was about federal charges. This was about making sure that what happened here today didn't just feel like justice, it became justice. The gallery emptied once again, but the energy in the room had shifted for good. And outside, in the courthouse hallways, the people waited. They waited with hope, with fear, with determination, because they knew something had changed, something real, something that couldn't be buried or ignored or swept under the rug anymore. And inside that silent courtroom, Judge Naomi Bradford sat tall behind her bench, staring down at the man who had walked in this morning thinking he owned the place. Because now, she owned this moment, and she was about to make sure the whole world knew it. The air inside the Richmond courthouse had shifted from thick tension to a different kind of pressure now. The kind that makes people sit up straighter, The kind that makes even the boldest defense attorneys second-guess their next move. Because this wasn't just about Officer Bradley Knox anymore. This had become bigger, much bigger. When the federal prosecutors arrived, they didn't come in quietly. They walked through those courtroom doors with purpose, briefcases in hand, flanked by 2 federal marshals. And the moment they entered, you could feel the temperature in the room drop. Like the walls themselves knew something irreversible was about to happen. Naomi didn't waste any time. "Officers, please escort Mr. Knox to the holding area," she ordered, her voice firm but even. "We will reconvene after the prosecution presents their new findings." Knox's lawyer immediately shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I must object. My client hasn't been formally charged under federal statute. This is irregular." Naomi didn't even blink. "Counselor, what's irregular is your client assaulting a sitting judge in open court. What's irregular is the mountain of evidence we've just watched together. What's irregular is how long this city has allowed your client to operate like he's above the law." The defense attorney sat back down, swallowing hard. Naomi nodded to the marshals. Knox didn't fight this time, maybe because he knew he'd already crossed the line, maybe because he realized the more he resisted, the worse this would get. Either way, for the first time since walking into this building, he didn't look like a man in control. He looked like a man who knew the walls were closing in. As Knox was escorted out, Naomi turned to the federal prosecutors. "You have the floor," she said. One of the prosecutors, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a sharper voice, stepped forward. Her name was Natalie Pierce, and if there was one thing she was known for, it was bringing bad cops to justice. She cleared her throat and addressed the court. "Thank you, Your Honor. The United States Department of Justice has reviewed the preliminary evidence presented today. Based on that review, we are prepared to pursue federal charges against Officer Bradley Knox, including but not limited to civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and aggravated assault against a federal officer." The weight of those words hit like a freight train. The gallery outside the courtroom stirred. Even through the closed doors, you could hear the rising hum of voices, reporters scrambling to get the story out, activists whispering to one another, people finally realizing this wasn't just for show. This was happening. Really happening. Natalie Pierce continued. "But that's not all," she added. "We have uncovered additional evidence from Richmond's Internal Affairs Division that has not yet been made public." The room leaned in again. For years, Officer Knox has been the subject of multiple complaints ranging from excessive force to falsified reports to racial profiling. Many of these complaints were dismissed without investigation. Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Dismissed?" she asked. Natalie nodded grimly. "Yes, Your Honor. And the trail leads straight to senior officials within the Richmond Police Department. Officials who systematically buried evidence, destroyed reports, and protected Officer Knox at the expense of this community." The courtroom held its breath again. Carla Mendez, the civil rights attorney who had been standing at the ready, stood up and addressed the court. "Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to introduce additional witnesses, whistleblowers from inside the department who can verify this cover-up." Naomi nodded slowly, her face hardening. "Bring them forward," she replied. The doors opened again, and 2 uniformed officers, both noticeably younger than Knox, both looking nervous but determined, stepped into the courtroom. They raised their right hands, swore the oath, took the stand, and then they told the truth. Testimony after testimony laid bare the corruption that had shielded Officer Knox for years. They spoke about internal memos, hidden video footage, and reports that mysteriously disappeared from the system. They described a department more concerned with protecting its reputation than protecting its people. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the layers of corruption were peeled back one by one. And Naomi? She listened to every single word. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. She let it all unfold like a surgeon exposing a wound that had been hidden for far too long. When the last whistleblower stepped down, Naomi leaned forward, resting her hands on the bench, her voice lower now, heavier. "This court has heard enough for today," she announced. "We will recess until tomorrow morning to allow both the prosecution and defense time to prepare." She paused, glancing around the room, making sure her next words landed exactly where they needed to. "But let me be clear," she continued. "What has been revealed here today will not be buried. Not in this courtroom. Not in this city. Not on my watch." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the room slowly began to stir. As people filed out, the press swarmed the hallway, but no one missed the moment when Naomi stood from the bench and walked down toward the families sitting in the front rows. The same families who had waited years for someone, anyone, to finally say, "Enough." She leaned down, shaking hands, exchanging quiet words of reassurance. And just beyond the crowd, Malcolm Johnson stood watching. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to. Their eyes met for just a moment. And that was enough, because they both knew this wasn't over. But for the first time in a long, long time, the fight wasn't one-sided. Outside the courthouse, the city of Richmond was awake. People lined the sidewalks, holding signs, chanting for justice. Reporters raced to broadcast what had just unfolded. And in homes all across the city, families gathered around their TVs and phones, watching history happen in real time. And somewhere, in a holding cell just a few floors below, Officer Bradley Knox sat alone. No badge, no gun, no shield to hide behind. Just a man finally being forced to face what he'd spent his whole career running from: accountability. And you could bet the whole city was going to be watching when that courtroom reopened tomorrow, because the fall of Bradley Knox had already begun, and it wasn't going to be quiet. It was going to be devastating. The next morning, the city felt different. It wasn't just the weight of what had already happened. It was the feeling that something bigger was building something heavier than anyone had dared to believe when this all started. The streets outside the courthouse were already lined with people when the sun came up. Reporters, protesters, supporters, all of them waiting for what came next. Inside, the tension felt thicker than before, like the air itself had doubled in pressure. No one needed to say it out loud, but everyone knew today was the day it stopped being just about Bradley Knox. This was about the entire system. Naomi Bradford walked into that courtroom with the same calm, controlled energy that had shaken Knox to his core the day before. She wasn't here to perform. She wasn't here to posture. She was here to finish what had started. The courtroom filled quickly, every seat taken, every corner lined with people standing, watching, holding their breath. And sitting quietly in the front row was Malcolm Johnson. His presence was louder than words. Knox was brought in next, this time without his uniform. No badge, no gun, just a plain shirt and slacks, stripped down to nothing but a man waiting for his reckoning. He didn't look up. He didn't scan the room like he had on the first day. He kept his eyes low, his jaw tight, his body stiff, but Naomi saw him, and she knew his fight wasn't over. Not yet. The federal prosecutor, Natalie Pierce, stood and addressed the court. Her voice was steady, her words razor-sharp. "Your Honor, the people are prepared to present the full findings of our federal investigation into Officer Knox and the Richmond Police Department." Naomi nodded once. "Proceed." Natalie turned toward the screen again, the same one that had broadcast Knox's brutal encounters the day before. But this time, she wasn't showing body cam footage. This time, she was showing something much worse. Internal emails, memos, signed statements from superior officers, evidence that the cover-up went all the way to the top. Natalie read them out loud, one by one. Emails from captains congratulating Knox for handling the troublemakers, memos instructing officers to keep pressure on neighborhoods with high minority populations, statements from whistleblowers who had been ordered to delete footage, shred reports, lie under oath. And then, the final blow. A signed authorization from a police chief, someone who had retired quietly just 2 years earlier, approving the destruction of files that could have held Knox accountable years ago. The room was stunned. Even Knox's lawyer, Alan Griffin, looked like the air had been sucked from his lungs. He stood up slowly, his face pale. "Your Honor, the defense requests a brief recess to confer with our client." Naomi leaned back, studying him, her voice as sharp as broken glass. "Denied." Alan's lips parted, but Naomi cut him off before he could get another word out. "We're done hiding behind delays and tactics. This city deserves to hear the truth." Now, Natalie didn't hesitate. "Your Honor, the people would like to call Officer Knox to the stand." You could feel the shock ripple through the courtroom. Knox flinched, turning to his lawyer, shaking his head violently. But Naomi leaned forward, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Officer Knox, you will take the stand." Knox stood slowly, every muscle in his body tight, like a man walking toward a cliff with no way back. He took the oath, Saturday down, gripped the edges of the witness stand so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. Natalie approached the stand, calm as ever. "Officer Knox," she began, "you've heard the evidence presented over the last 2 days. The videos, the emails, the statements. Do you deny that these events happened under your watch?" Knox didn't speak. "Do you deny that you assaulted Judge Bradford in this courtroom?" Still, silence. Natalie took a step closer. "Do you deny that you used your badge to terrorize citizens of this city, knowing your department would protect you?" Knox's jaw trembled, but he didn't open his mouth. Naomi leaned forward, her voice low, dangerous. "You're under oath, officer. You will answer." Knox's fists clenched tighter. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I did my job," he muttered, his voice cracking. Natalie raised an eyebrow. "Your job?" Knox swallowed hard. I followed orders." The courtroom shifted. People leaned in, whispering. The tension snapped tight like a stretched rubber band ready to break. Naomi leaned closer, locking eyes with him. "Whose orders?" she asked. Knox broke. His voice rose desperate, angry, unraveling. "All of them," he shouted. "I did everything they told me to do. You think this was just me? You think I came up with this on my own?" The room gasped. Knox pointed toward the evidence screen, toward the back of the courtroom, toward the very walls themselves. "They told me to keep the streets clean. They told me to put pressure on those neighborhoods. They told me to keep them in line." He slammed his hand on the stand, breathing hard, his face red with rage. "I did my job. I followed their rules." The courtroom exploded with noise people shouting, reporters scrambling, the bailiff calling for order. Naomi struck her gavel hard, again and again, until the room finally settled into stunned silence. "And then," she spoke. "No, Officer Knox," she said, her voice cold as ice. "You didn't do your job." She stood, her presence filling every inch of that courtroom. "Your job was to serve, to protect, to uphold the law with integrity. Your job was to stand for justice, not twist it into a weapon." Knox sat frozen, his shoulders slumped, the fight drained from his body. Naomi turned toward the courtroom. "And let the record show," she continued, "that this city, this community, will not let this happen again." The gavel struck one final time. The world had heard the truth, and nothing would ever be the same. When the gavel dropped, the energy in the courtroom didn't settle the way you might expect. You could feel something else, building something deeper. Because while the people sitting in those pews had heard the truth, they also knew the truth wasn't enough by itself. Not yet. Justice, real justice, isn't just about the truth coming to light. It's about accountability, about consequences, about someone finally answering for the pain they've caused. And nobody knew that better than Malcolm Johnson. He stood silently in the back of the courtroom now, his arms crossed over his chest, watching Officer Knox slump in that witness chair like a man who had just lost everything. But Malcolm didn't look satisfied. He didn't look relieved. Because he'd seen this before. He'd seen public outrage. He'd heard public apologies. He'd watched officials promise change, only to watch everything quietly go back to the way it had always been. And when Naomi Bradford stood and called for the court to break for lunch, Malcolm knew what he had to do. As the crowd began to rise and file toward the exits, Malcolm pushed his way toward the front, past the press, past the attorneys, past the courtroom staff who tried to wave him off, and he spoke. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't shout, but somehow, the room fell silent anyway. "Your Honor," Malcolm said, standing just a few feet from the bench, his voice steady. "I need to speak." Naomi looked down at him, surprised by the interruption, but there was something in his voice, something that made her pause. She nodded once. Malcolm turned to face the room, the crowded gallery, the legal teams, the cameras still rolling in the back. And then, he looked right at Bradley Knox. "My name is Malcolm Johnson," he began again, though everyone already knew it by now. "And for the last 20 years, I've watched men like you walk away from moments like this." Knox shifted uncomfortably, but Malcolm didn't blink. "I've watched you terrorize my neighbors. I've watched you put my grandson in the hospital. I've watched you lie and threaten and humiliate us. And every time, you walked out of that door untouched. Every single time. You could hear people breathing harder in the gallery now. You could feel the tension thickening. But I want you to hear me when I say this. Malcolm took a step closer, his voice tightening. This time, you don't get to walk away. Knox flinched, his jaw clenching again. But Malcolm didn't stop. You see, this isn't just about what you did to me or to my family. This is about every single person in this city who has ever had to wonder if they'd make it home alive after a traffic stop. This is about every parent who's had to teach their child how to keep their hands visible, how not to speak too loudly, how not to exist in a way that makes people like you uncomfortable. Naomi watched, unmoving, her eyes locked on Malcolm, letting him speak truths that the justice system so often tried to package into legal terms. But this was bigger than legal arguments. This was life. This was lived experience. This was the voice of a community refusing to be silenced. Malcolm turned back to Naomi now, his voice breaking just a little. And I'm tired, Judge. God knows I'm tired. I'm tired of standing in rooms like this, wondering if it'll make a difference, wondering if any of this will stick, wondering if tomorrow we'll wake up and find out nothing really changed at all. The courtroom was frozen, everyone waiting to hear what Naomi would say next. But Naomi, she didn't say anything right away. She stood slowly, stepping down from the bench, walking to stand just a few feet from Malcolm. And then, in a voice so low the cameras almost missed it, she spoke. "You're not alone, Mr. Johnson." Malcolm's shoulders tightened, his eyes glossing over. "I've been fighting this system my whole life too," Naomi continued, her voice shaking just slightly, not from fear but from something deeper. "I've sat in rooms where no one believed me. I've been the only black woman at the table more times than I can count. And every time, they told me to be grateful just to be in the room and to keep quiet." She took a breath. "But I didn't." She turned toward Knox, her expression hardening. "And I won't." The silence felt alive now, heavy, raw, real. Naomi turned back to the crowd, raising her voice just enough to fill the room. "This court has heard your pain. It has seen the evidence. It has watched the truth unfold in front of all of us." She paused, scanning the faces in the gallery, the mothers, the fathers, the sons and daughters who had carried this weight for far too long. "And I promise you this justice will be served." The gavel struck again, sending a final jolt through the courtroom. "We will reconvene this afternoon for closing arguments," she announced. "And this court will not rest until accountability is delivered." The crowd slowly began to rise again, but this time, they didn't feel defeated. They didn't feel hopeless. They felt something they hadn't felt in a long, long time. They felt seen. As the courtroom emptied, Malcolm stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall, tears threatening to fall but pride holding them back. Naomi stepped out a moment later, walking toward him. No cameras, no microphones, just two people standing on the same side of a battle they'd both been fighting for far too long. Malcolm nodded once, his voice cracking. "Thank you." Naomi didn't smile. She didn't offer some hollow reassurance. She just placed her hand on his shoulder and said the only words that mattered now. "Stay ready." Because she knew the hardest part was still to come. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the towering glass windows of the Richmond courthouse as the city braced itself for what came next. Word had already spread far beyond Virginia. News outlets from across the country had picked up the story. Social media was on fire. Hashtags calling for justice, accountability, and reform trended nationwide. And inside that courthouse, everyone knew the moment had finally arrived. The courtroom filled again, even more crowded than before. The energy was thick. People stood shoulder to shoulder, some clutching their phones, others holding on to each other. Reporters whispered urgently into microphones, capturing every breath, every glance. Malcolm Johnson sat quietly in the front row, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His face looked calm, but his knuckles were white from the pressure. Naomi Bradford entered last, stepping through the side door, her face unreadable. She took her seat behind the bench like she had every other day, but today felt different. Today, she wasn't just presiding over a courtroom. She was standing in the eye of a national storm. She let the silence hang for a moment longer before finally addressing the room. "We are here," she said, her voice steady, "to hear closing arguments." The federal prosecutor, Natalie Pierce stood first. Her steps were measured, deliberate, like a woman carrying the weight of every story, every name, every unseen face this case had come to represent. She didn't pace. She didn't dramatize. She simply stood in the center of the room, took a quiet breath, and began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed over the last 2 days was never just about one man. This was never just about Bradley Knox. This was never just about one bad cop. This is about a system that allowed him to operate unchecked. It's about the victims who were ignored, silenced, and left to carry the weight of their pain alone. The courtroom hung on every word. Bradley Knox didn't act alone. He was protected, enabled, given permission, again and again, to turn his badge into a weapon. We've heard from witnesses, we've seen the emails, we've watched the videos, and when given the chance to take responsibility, he didn't. Natalie paused, turning toward Knox. He sat motionless, jaw locked, eyes cast downward. Instead, he doubled down. He blamed the system that protected him. He blamed everyone but himself. Natalie turned back to the gallery, her voice rising just slightly, heavy with conviction. Today, you have the power to say that's not good enough. You have the power to hold him accountable, no, just for the lives he's shattered, but for every life that could be harmed if men like him are allowed to continue. She walked slowly toward the jury box. Don't let this moment pass like so many others. Make it matter. And with that, she sat down. The room shifted again as Knox's attorney, Alan Griffin, stood next. He adjusted his tie, glanced nervously at Knox, and walked to the center of the room. But when he opened his mouth, the weight in the air didn't move with him. He tried to frame Knox as a man under pressure, a man following orders, a man doing his job in a system that demanded impossible choices. He tried to paint the case as a witch hunt, a media spectacle, a political stunt. But the room didn't buy it. You could feel it. Even Alan knew it. His words landed flat, empty, unconvincing. And when he finally sat back down, the silence felt like a verdict already delivered. Naomi waited a long moment before standing. She scanned the room, the faces, the history, the pain, the hope. And then she spoke. Throughout this hearing, we've heard difficult truths. We've seen the cost of unchecked power. We've witnessed the damage done to families, to communities, to this city. Her voice was low but steady, each word landing like a drumbeat. This is not just about one man's mistakes. This is about a system that allowed those mistakes to go unpunished. It is about a city that must decide if it is brave enough to confront that truth not just today, but every day that follows. She leaned forward slightly. Officer Knox, stand. The bailiff motioned, and Knox stood slowly, his body stiff, his eyes still refusing to meet Naomi's quote. You have been found guilty in the court of public record, and this court, based on overwhelming evidence and testimony, finds you legally guilty on all counts. Gasps rippled through the gallery, followed by a long, stunned silence. Naomi didn't stop. For years, you used your badge not to protect, but to terrorize. You used your power not to serve, but to destroy. And when given the chance to tell the truth, you chose cowardice. She took a deep breath, her voice hardening like steel. Today that ends. She looked down at the sentencing report in front of her. Officer Bradley Knox, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed under federal law for civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and aggravated assault on a federal officer. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over every inch of that room. You will be remanded into federal custody immediately. You will serve no less than 30 years in a federal correctional facility. You will have no parole, no early release, and you will carry the mark of your actions for the rest of your life. The gavel came down one final time. The room erupted not in cheers, but in tears, in gasps, in the quiet, trembling sound of people realizing they had finally been heard. Malcolm Johnson stood slowly, placing a hand over his heart, his throat tightening as he watched Knox being led away in handcuffs. For the first time in his life, he saw accountability delivered in full view of the people. Naomi stood behind the bench, watching it all unfold, knowing this was just the beginning. The cameras would leave, the reporters would move on, but the people in this room, they would carry this moment with them forever. And when she finally stepped down and walked toward the exit, the crowd parted, not in fear, not in silence, but in respect, because they knew She hadn't just ruled from the bench. She had stood for all of them, and she wasn't finished yet. Long after the cameras had stopped flashing, long after the headlines faded from the breaking news banners, Richmond was still wide awake. The courtroom had emptied, but the city hadn't gone quiet. Not this time. Not after what they had witnessed. Word had already spread like wildfire across neighborhoods, across churches, across schools. People who had lived in the shadows of fear for years, people who had whispered to their children about how to survive encounters with men like Bradley Knox, now stood a little taller, spoke a little louder, walked a little freer. But even in that moment of victory, Judge Naomi Bradford knew something most people didn't want to admit. Justice wasn't the finish line. It was just the first step. That evening, she sat alone in her chambers. The courthouse lights were dim, the city's glow flickering through the tall windows behind her. She should have felt relief. She should have felt proud. And in a way, she did. But more than anything, she felt the weight of the truth pressing heavy on her chest. She had seen this before, moments that looked like change, but didn't last. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the file still sitting on her desk. It was thick, heavy, full of names, faces, stories that had gone unheard for far too long. People who never got their day in court, people who never got to see the justice that had just been served today. And deep down, she knew that one verdict couldn't erase all of that pain. One man behind bars couldn't undo decades of damage. One victory didn't fix a broken system. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up, expecting a clerk or a security officer, but it wasn't either of them. It was Malcolm Johnson. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his shoulders heavy, but his eyes held something Naomi hadn't seen in a long, long time. "Hope, may I?" he asked quietly. Naomi nodded, motioning for him to come in. He closed the door behind him, stepping into the dim light, looking like a man who had waited his whole life to say something, but wasn't sure where to begin. "I just wanted to say thank you," he started, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for today, but for standing when it counted." Naomi leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "I didn't do it alone," she replied softly. "You stood too. So did this city." Malcolm let out a slow breath, nodding. "I know," he whispered. "But I also know what's coming." Naomi's heart tightened. She knew exactly what he meant. The backlash, the pushback, the people in power who would work twice as hard to protect the ones still hiding in the shadows. The officials who would try to spin today's ruling as an isolated incident, just one bad apple, nothing more. "I've seen them do it before," Malcolm continued. "Clean it up for the cameras, say the right things for the headlines, and then go right back to business as usual." Naomi leaned back, staring out the window for a long moment. "Not this time," she finally said. "I won't let them." Malcolm studied her, searching for the cracks that life had carved into both of them, but all he saw was resolve. "Then you won't be standing alone," he replied, his voice stronger now. Naomi felt something loosen in her chest, a breath she didn't know she'd been holding finally slipping free. They sat in silence for a moment longer. Two people who had seen too much, lost too much, but refused to give up. Finally, Malcolm stood, placing his hat back on his head. "We started something today," he said quietly. "Let's make sure we finish it." Naomi nodded, rising to her feet. "We will." Malcolm reached out, shaking her hand with the kind of grip that said more than words ever could. And then, he turned to leave. Naomi watched him go, her heart pounding not with fear, but with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: purpose. As the door clicked shut behind him, she turned back to her desk. She gathered the files, the names, the stories, and for the first time since the verdict, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this city was finally ready to face itself. Outside, the streets were still alive with voices, people who had gathered not just to witness history, but to become part of it. Signs waved in the air, chants echoed down the block. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't rage, it was a community rising. And Naomi knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be, because justice doesn't come from one ruling. It doesn't come from one conviction. It comes from what happens after. It comes from people who refuse to forget. It comes from voices that refuse to be silenced. It comes from those who stand not just when the cameras are rolling but long after the lights go out. And as Naomi stepped out onto those courthouse steps, the crowd parted once more, not in fear, not in curiosity, but in solidarity. And when she stood before them, she didn't speak as a judge. She spoke as a citizen, as a mother, as a daughter of this city. And in a voice that carried through the night air, she said the words they all needed to hear. This isn't over. We keep going. We keep fighting. We keep holding every single person accountable until justice is not the exception, but the rule. And with that, she stepped down into the crowd, because the courtroom may have emptied, but the real work was just beginning. The courthouse lights faded into the night as Richmond slowly settled into a restless calm. People drifted back to their homes, back to their families, carrying with them the weight of everything they'd witnessed. But even as the streets began to clear, no one could shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something real. Something lasting. Judge Naomi Bradford stood alone on the courthouse steps for a long while after the crowd had gone. She watched as the last of the news vans pulled away. Watched as the city seemed to exhale, if only for a moment. And standing there under the quiet glow of the streetlights, she let herself feel all of it. The weight, the exhaustion, the small flicker of hope she had tried so hard to protect. It had been a long road, a brutal fight, and while the cameras might have caught the ending, Naomi knew there wasn't an ending. Not really. This was just the next chapter in a fight she'd been part of her entire life. The next morning, Naomi returned to her chambers earlier than usual. She had barely slept, but refused to stop turning. She sat down at her desk, staring at the growing stack of letters, emails, and messages that had poured in overnight. Some were from supporters, others were less kind. But that wasn't what caught her attention. Sitting right on top of the pile was a small handwritten envelope. No return address, no markings, just her name. She opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. And when she read the words, her breath caught in her throat. It was from Malcolm Johnson. It wasn't long, it wasn't fancy, but it was powerful. Judge Bradford, you didn't just rule from the bench. You stood for every one of us who's ever been told to sit down and be quiet. For every one of us who's ever been made to feel small. For every one of us who wondered if justice would ever belong to us, too. You showed us what it looks like when someone refuses to look away. And because of you, I believe again. Thank you. We'll keep standing with you, not behind you. Naomi sat back in her chair, closing her eyes as the weight of those words settled deep in her chest. He was right. They had started something, but it couldn't stop here. She knew the system didn't change overnight. She knew there were still people in power scrambling behind closed doors to control the damage, to protect themselves, to convince the world that this was just one bad officer, not the system itself. She knew the road ahead would be long, hard, unforgiving, but she also knew they weren't walking it alone anymore. That afternoon, Naomi met with court officials, community leaders, and federal investigators. She laid out plans to audit not just Officer Knox's actions, but the entire Richmond Police Department. She demanded full transparency, independent oversight, community involvement in every step of the process. And she didn't stop there. She reached out to state officials, to civil rights organizations, to legal aid groups. She called on them to expand the investigation to look beyond Richmond, beyond Virginia, and into every department where men like Knox had been allowed to operate unchecked. Because this wasn't just a Richmond problem. It was America's problem. And Naomi wasn't going to stop until someone started treating it like one. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, press conferences, and late nights. But with every step forward, the community grew louder, stronger, more united. They organized town halls. They formed watchdog committees. They showed up not just when the news crews were there, but when the cameras were gone, when the work was quiet, when the fight was harder. And Naomi, she stood with them, day after day, night after night, because she knew that real change didn't come from one courtroom ruling. It came from people who refused to give up. One evening, as she prepared to leave the courthouse, she spotted a familiar face waiting by the front steps. Malcolm Johnson. He wasn't alone this time. Standing beside him was his grandson, Andre. The same young man who had once been the face of this city's failure. The same young man who had spent years carrying the trauma of what Bradley Knox had done to him. But today, Andra stood tall. Naomi approached them slowly, unsure of what to say, but she didn't have to say a word. Andra spoke first. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady, his eyes clear. Naomi felt her throat tighten. "You don't owe me thanks," she replied. "You deserved this a long time ago." Andre nodded, glancing at his grandfather before turning back to her. "I know," he whispered. "But it means something to hear someone finally say it out loud." Naomi smiled softly, feeling the weight of all those silent years finally start to lift. Malcolm stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You ready for the next round?" he asked, half smiling. Naomi let out a soft breath, looking out at the city she had spent her whole life fighting for. "I've never been more ready," she replied. And in that moment, standing together on the courthouse steps under the fading light, they knew something simple but powerful. The fight wasn't over. It might never be over. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't fighting alone. And that made all the difference. Sometimes, it's easy to believe that standing up for what's right won't change anything, that the system is too big, too broken, too far gone. But what this story teaches us is simple. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. It happens when people like Malcolm Johnson, who had every reason to give up, choose to keep showing up. It happens when leaders like Judge Naomi Bradford refuse to look the other way, even when it's easier, even when it's safer. And maybe the most powerful lesson is this: you don't have to stand alone. Whether you're in a courtroom, a neighborhood, or your own family, standing up for justice, for dignity, for what's right, takes all of us. So today, take that with you. Remember that your voice still matters. Your story still matters. You are never too old, too tired, or too late to make a difference in someone's life, including your own. Because sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one person brave enough to stand, to remind the world that justice is worth fighting for. And if no one's told you lately, we're glad you're still standing. If this story spoke to you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you of the power we all hold, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story that just might change the way you see the world. We appreciate you being part of this journey with us. Until next time, take care and keep standing strong.